And, hi everyone, I'm Wei Liu. I've been a member of the Academy since 2019. And right now I lead ESG strategy at the Alibaba Group. I have the background in international development and climate on these topics. And I'm really glad that we are having Katherine Stapleton today from the World Bank joining us to give us a very interesting talk on the technology and on research on emerging technologies and trade. I want to say that, because everyone on this webinar knows that yesterday we had, it was announced that this year's Nobel Prize in economics were given to three, top economists. And I would say their research, have a lot to do with what Katherine will be talking with us today. And so we're actually, I don't want to say that the Academy actually predicted in whatever way, but it's a very nice coincidence. So let me just do a bit more introduction of Katherine. So Katherine is an economist in the bank's macroeconomics, trade, and investment global practice. She's also a research associate at Oxford's Department of Economics, as well as the Center for the Study of African Economies. She's also an external research fellow at the UK's Institute for the Future of Work, and her work mainly focuses on international trade, emerging technologies, innovation, climate policy, and development. And the later ones are especially what I am focusing on recently. And so without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Katherine. And just to say that Katherine will be covering 3 papers today. And so, I believe all of you have seen the titles of papers. And if you go to our chat box, we have also the 3 papers and their links in the chat box. So we'll do it in this way today. So usually we allowed our audience to raise questions in the middle. So we'll still do that if you have any pressing questions. And we'll also do an interval after each of the paper is presented for questions specifically related to this paper. And we'll still have a kind of overall discussion at the end of the talk. And we expect that the 3 papers will be presented, and the paper level discussion will last for about an hour, and we will have up to 30 minutes toward the end for an overall discussion of all the audience. And so again, without further ado, welcome, Katherine, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Liu, for this introduction, and thank you to the Academy for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today. So today I'll be presenting 3 papers on this broad theme of how emerging technologies and trade interact. So the first one is going to be on a big question of how firm networks facilitate the diffusion of new technologies. Then the second paper will be looking at the context of Spain specifically and asking this question of how has the rise of robots and automation affected trade, and has it resulted in reshoring and the movement of firm value chains back to advanced economies. And the third will be looking at another key interaction that happened in 2022 with the global energy crisis and the countries' cross-border reliance on other countries for energy imports, and how that shock dissipated through multinational supply chains and what it meant for the diffusion of emerging low-carbon technologies specifically. And so I'll stop in between each of these papers, but I'll start with the first one. So the first one is called Firm Networks and Global Technology Diffusion, and this is joint work with colleagues at Oxford University and the World Bank's Trade Group. And so the motivation for this paper is that we've known for a long time that the spread of new technologies is a crucial driver of the process of cross-country development. And there's been plenty of evidence trying to understand what drives the diffusion of new technologies. However, there's been a lack of data to date that actually maps global value chains and also is able to understand firm level adoption of technologies, which has meant we've known relatively little about how technologies spread through multinational value chains. Although it's been believed that firm linkages play a crucial role, particularly in productivity upgrading, we haven't actually known before the extent to which firm value chains matter for the spread of new technologies. And so what we're doing in this paper is really a data innovation where we're combining data on online job adverts, which allows us to measure the spread of really frontier technologies. And we're combining this with multinational linkages data. And so this is exactly what we're doing here is we've got data for 29 technologies across 17 different countries and around 100,000 firms over the period of 2014 to 2022. And we're linking this data with multinational firm level linkage data provided by FactSet, which is a new company that scraped and collated this data. And then what we're doing is we're looking at the emergence of 29 disruptive technologies, as has been classified by Nick Bloom and their co-authors. And then we're looking at how these technologies spread through existing firm linkages. So specifically, we're going to look at firms that were linked before a technology emerged to other firms in the linkage location. And then we're looking at how this spread through firm networks through these linkages. And so what we find here is a few key things in a nutshell. A crucial finding is we find that today still emerging technologies are highly concentrated in only the Fortune 500 firms and their global value chains. So around 1/3 of all new jobs related to these emerging technologies are solely concentrated in only these 500 multinational firms and their buyers, suppliers, and innovation partners. And we find that linkages have played a very important role in the spread of these technologies from their emergence locations in the US to other areas of the world. And the most important relationship has been buyer relationships and innovation partner relationships. So let me walk through each parts of this in turn now. I'll skip related literature. So the data we have specifically is we're following now a growing literature that's using online job adverts data to really get at measurement of frontier disruptive technologies. So the advantage of this is, say, if we were looking for machine learning engineers, there's no occupation code which would help us pin this down in traditional labor force statistics, because often the occupational classification hasn't caught up with the technologies and takes a few years to do so. But if you look at an online job advert, you can very quickly see if a company is asking for large language models or natural language processing. They might mention that in the text of the job advert, which allows us to pick up emerging technologies really at the fastest way possible from this text data. And so we're combining this data comprehensively for 17 countries, which are mainly advanced economies, over the whole period of 2014 to 2022. And we then combine this with data on multinational firm linkages from this new company called FactSet, which has essentially scraped various supply chain relationship information from firm company records and other sources and created a network of firm linkages globally for the largest multinational firms. And so this allows us to build this panel of the multinational firms and their linkages and all of their job adverts and the job adverts that relate to disruptive or emerging technologies. And so we match these data sets using exact matching on the names or fuzzy matching, which allows us to find a match rate of around 85% of the multinational firm network data within the online scraped job adverts data set, allowing us to really pick up almost all online job postings posted by these multinational firms and their supply chains. And so then what we're doing is following a growing literature that measures new technologies using the words mentioned in these job adverts. So we start with the raw text of the job adverts, and this allows us to pin down various emerging technologies. Currently, we're using one measure that's recently been created by Nick Bloom and his co-authors of specific disruptive technologies that emerged over the past 10 years. And then we're looking at the share of postings that relate to each of these technologies within each firm that we've matched to in the other data set. And so what we find, a first finding is it's really 5 technologies that are seeing rapid spread in terms of job postings online. And these are social networking, cloud computing, smart devices, machine learning and AI, and online streaming. So we're really looking at primarily those in the data sets. And what we find is there's generally been a rapid increase in posting of job adverts related to these technologies. And this is also highly related to, we're also using data set of earnings calls transcripts from multinational firms, which is essentially their shareholder meetings, which are recorded, and the extent to which they're discussing these frontier technologies in their meetings with their shareholders. So these 2 measures are highly correlated. And consistent with literature before on technology diffusion, we find that richer countries have higher shares of their job adverts posted online related to these emerging technologies, suggesting technologies are spreading faster to richer countries, which is consistent with quite a long literature in the economics of technology field. And what we also find is over time, these job adverts have become more dispersed and more spread out across countries, suggesting rapid diffusion. Then what we're next looking is at the role of distance. And so for this, we're taking the locations where technologies emerged, which is essentially the location which saw the most patenting for the technology in its first 10 years of emergence. And we're then calling these pioneer locations of each technology. And then what we're looking at is the extent to which technologies have spread from these emergence locations to other cities and firms around the world. And so also similar to what's been found in literature measuring technology in other ways is we find that technology jobs do spread to closer locations faster, and they also spread to richer locations faster. And these are the coefficients. So you see really at the top, the distance matters a lot. Oh, sorry, income per capita matters a lot, whereas distance has been more of a moderate negative effect, but really an important role of income per capita. And when we look at across firms as well, we find that firms that are further away also see slower adoption of these technologies or slower posting of jobs related to these emerging technologies. So then looking specifically at the role of supply chains next. So another finding is that these job adverts related to these emerging technologies still are very highly concentrated in only Fortune 500 firms and their supply chains. So for reference, in our data set, there are around 160,000 firms, yet these 500 Fortune 500 world's largest firms are accounting for around 1/3 of all of these new emerging technology related postings when we include their supply chain partners as well, which means 1 in 3 of all new jobs related to any of these emerging technologies is concentrated solely in a Fortune 500 on their supply chain, which is really a substantial share concentrated in these firms. And so we're now going to look at how technologies spread from their pioneer location through the supply chains of these multinational firms. And so to do so, we start off with these pioneer locations, and then we're defining a firm as being in a pioneer location and the same industry as the technology is therefore being an emergence or pioneer firm. And then we're looking at firms that were linked to these firms, these pioneer firms in different locations before the technologies emerged as measured using the patents data, whether we see faster spread of technologies to these firms that already were linked to each other before the technologies emerged. And so for this, we're looking at technologies that emerged from 2005 onwards, which is when we can see them in our FactSet data. And so when we look at where these pioneer locations are for all of the technologies that emerged since 2005, we see they're very likely to be concentrated just on the east or west coast of the US, and they're all pioneered in the US. Every single one of these technologies, when you look at the stock of patents globally over the 10 years before it emerged, there we find every single location that accounts for at least 50% of these is in the US. So then the key thing we find next is, so looking at these firms that were linked to pioneer firms before the emergence of technologies. At the top, this shows that these firms that are in the pioneer locations see substantially more job adverts compared to non-pioneer firms. And on the second line, we see here that this effect has dissipated over time, suggesting initially these jobs related to these technologies were highly concentrated in these locations, but over time, they have gradually spread away from these firms in these locations to other places. And then what we also find is when we look at the firms that were buyers of these technologies, buyers of these pioneer firms before the technology emerged, these see substantially more posting related to these job adverts, related to these technologies after the technology emerges. So this is the result for buyers, and also firms that were innovation partners before the technologies emerged also saw more rapid diffusion. And then on the right-hand side, when we control for all these linkages at once, what we see is these two are the ones that continue to stand out. So summing up, what this means is that firms that were buyers or innovation partners of a firm that was in a location where a technology emerged, after it emerged, they're more likely to see more rapid diffusion of those technologies, suggesting these linkages play an important role in the spread of the technologies. Then similarly, this effect is not happening through distance, because when we control for distance, we still see an important role of these linkages, even in addition to the fact that firms may be closer by. When we're looking here, we're excluding firms in the same location. So this means even if you're a buyer or an innovation partner of a firm, and you're a lot closer, irrespective of being closer, you still see faster diffusion of the technologies through these linkages. And then when we look, there's been a whole debate and a literature in the economics field that's been discussing multinational linkages and whether we see more innovation happening in-house within the boundaries of a firm from, say, the headquarter to an affiliate, or whether there's greater spread of technologies to firms outside. And what we find is that it's actually linkages outside of the firm boundaries that are driving these results. So it's not a buyer that's within the same firm company grouping that's driving this, but it's a buyer that's external and a separate legal entity to the firm that's driving the results, which is what we see here, is the results are really coming from the buyers outside of the orgs. Then when we look at multiple linkages, so this is combining these different linkages, what we find is it's buyers and suppliers. In fact, almost all of these combinations have mattered as well. So firms that share multiple linkages, so that both a buyer and an innovation partner, or a supplier and an innovation partner, also saw more significant results than firms that are solely have one linkage. Then a few things just to check. We asked the question of whether this is just a US specific result, that it's only mattering for firms that are linked to the firms within the US, but we find this is not the case, and this role of linkages is actually occurring even when we control for the US as well. When we interact the results with the US, we don't find any statistically significant results, suggesting it matters just as much being outside the US as being inside the US. And the same holds when we look over time. Then also we ask whether this is just a Silicon Valley effect, but the same results hold when we exclude Silicon Valley. And we also, when we look again at affiliates and looking at whether being a buyer and a buyer that's an affiliate drives these results, we find this is not the case. And again, this suggests the results are coming from firm linkages outside of the firm corporate boundary. Likewise, when we look at the interaction with distance, we also find there's limited effect, suggesting that these linkages are above and beyond the role of distance. So to sum up again, so what we do in this paper is we combine this rich data on online job adverts with multinational firm networks data in order to look at the role of firm-to-firm linkages in the spread of technologies. And what we find is consistent with the literature. Distance matters for the diffusion of emerging technologies. Technologies spread faster to closer locations, and income per capita matters as well. Technologies spread faster to richer locations. But in addition to what's been found in the existing literature, we show that international firm networks play an important role in the diffusion of these emerging technologies. And this seems to matter above and beyond distance and income per capita, suggesting that global firm networks have been a key driver of technology diffusion over time. And we find that it still holds that hiring related to emerging technologies is highly concentrated in Fortune 500 firms and their supply chains, suggesting it's these large multinational firms that are playing a very important role in the spread of emerging technologies around the world. And when we look within these networks to understand the relationships that seem to matter the most, we find it's buyers of firms that are pioneering the technologies and innovation partners. So innovation partners, it's clear to understand why that result probably holds. For buyers, this also suggests it's consistent with the literature on imported technological change, where potentially firms are buying from innovative firms and then backwards inducing or learning about the technologies through this buying process of using their technologies as inputs. And we find that this is an important global pattern and not just something within the US. So thank you very much. I'll stop there and we could have some quick questions on this paper first.
Thank you, Catherine. We're opening the floor for a few questions. Okay, I will throw a question first. So actually, when you show us the industries, right? These are tech, what we call digital tech industries, and I wonder. I mean, and I also saw, if I remember it correctly, there's also solar power. I could see 2 or 3 different categories of them, and I mean, I kind of assume that these different generations of technologies have probably different type of global value chain. And so, I mean, I'm not sure whether the data allow you to do this when you're aggregating different types of technologies. And so any idea on whether, let's say the digital tech and some more industrial tech varies in how this, diffusion may happen, maybe either due to the nature of the technology and also how they rely on existing kind of value chain structure, right? And as well as on their natural distribution across different economies. And there are also people in there, for example, let's say there are specific countries where, you find nationalities, let's say Chinese, Indians are quite many of them in say, digital sector. So things like that.
Yeah, I think thank you. This is a really important question. So we haven't looked specifically at different types of technologies and how they spread, but I think that's a good idea. So I'll go away and see if we can do this. I think most of these technologies, given when you look at, we're kind of finding around 80% of what we're seeing is really
Yeah.
just these 5 technologies. Which are all quite similar, right? They're digital technologies, social networking, cloud computing, smart devices, ML, and online streaming. So I think our results are really being driven by these digital technologies rather than, I think, yeah, as you mentioned, these industrial technologies like solar power, or I guess some of them down the bottom,
There's
we're clearly not
batteries.
seeing much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they're not really showing up. I think they may not have fully shown up yet in the job ads data, which is why we're not quite seeing so many of them. And my guess is they probably would have very different patterns, because I do think digital technologies may spread faster, particularly when they're ones that are very easy to use, or quite easy for multinationals to be using, or not limited to only a specific industry. But yeah, I'll definitely take a look at that and see if we can group them up into more industry specific ones, whether we see any different patterns of diffusion. Then in
Yes.
terms, you asked a question about China and India. So unfortunately in our data set, we've really got it's
I know
advanced
there's 17
economies
countries. Yeah.
mainly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a limitation of this is unfortunately we don't have data for China and India, which are probably also like a major driver of some of the diffusion through multinational supply chains. So this is really it's basically Europe plus some other advanced economies, Australia, Singapore.
OECD countries.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
OECD, exactly. So it would be interesting. We would love at some point to do a version of this where we could include more emerging markets in India and China as well. But I would think, I think in the Chinese context, at least, there's been a lot of focus of the literature on the role of multinational supply chains, particularly in technology diffusion in the earlier years of China's development. So I can imagine a similar pattern might have held before, but that linkage may have broken down now with kind of geopolitical tensions.
Hello.
Sure. Great.
Hi.
Prof. Chen, yeah.
Yes, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes.
So let's summarize at this point, what are the main implications of your funding?
Yeah, so a crucial implication is before we didn't know the extent to which multinationals have played a role in the diffusion of technologies. But now by establishing this, it suggests for developing countries, at least then, if they're looking to tap into new technologies, therefore attracting multinationals or encouraging firms to become part of multinational supply chains and passing that barrier may be an important way to see faster diffusion of these technologies from emerging locations, which is an important finding, because before the literature hadn't actually told us that. It had told us that higher income countries see faster technology diffusion. It had shown a big role in immigration and individual linkages and people studying abroad in innovative locations on the transfer of technology. But if actually one of the key drivers of the technology diffusion is multinationals and their supply chains, it suggests attracting multinationals and their supply chains could be an important way to accelerate the diffusion of technologies.
Right. So it seems to me there are two interesting implications. One is that multinational companies play a crucial role for the technology diffusion globally. So there must be like policies friendly toward this direction. Second is that in the digital age, the spreading of technology is the same carrier, maybe that is much faster than before. So I think both are important. We can also verify this in China. Actually, in China, in the digital age, a lot of the companies, most of the most important companies these days in China, internet companies, they were invested by foreign funds. So I think multinational companies, foreign funds, they probably all played a crucial role in the technology diffusion, conversion of that into implications in the other countries' economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the technology is diffusing faster is definitely a key takeaway. There's also the fact that distance matters less over time is another key finding of this, suggesting that previously maybe distance because you would need a lot more business people flying to the headquarters and people-to-people interactions. But now with the emergence of the internet and digital technologies, distance may not matter so much before. It's more how connected you are to the frontier. And multinationals are one of those key channels of connection.
Right. Agree.
So thank you. Maybe I can move on then quickly to the next paper, given we don't have that much time.
Sure, please.
So this previous paper was discussing the role of multinationals as an enabler of technology diffusion, which is, but this paper now is going to look at a different question of whether multinationals and the offshoring of production has also been affected by technology. So here we're looking specifically at the case of automation, and this is joint work with my colleague who was a PhD student at Stanford. And so what this paper is asking is, did automation in high-income countries drive a reduction in offshoring to developing countries? So has the emergence of technologies also resulted in a recalibration of supply chains? And so the motivation for this paper is we've seen a lot of discussion in popular media about how robots and automation may lead to reshoring and mean that there's less incentive for firms to move production to developing countries. So on the left is just a Harvard Business Review article in 2014, which was saying that robots are making offshoring less attractive, that they would spell the end of globalization. And we'd see this kind of localization of production happening again because there's less of the gains from wage differentials. But there was very limited empirical evidence actually answering this question of how robots have affected trade. And where there was, they had often relied on industry level measures of automation, meaning we didn't really know what was going on in terms of mechanisms. But from a development perspective, this is also a crucial question for developing countries, because obviously a lot of money is being spent on trying to attract offshoring, and a whole wave of countries are looking to go through this manufacturing-led development process. And so what we do in this paper is we're combining this data on on Spanish manufacturing firms, some of which are multinationals, and it has rich data on both whether they're using different types of automation technologies, particularly robots, and on their supply chains. And so what we do is we try and look at the causal impact of firms that start automating on their multinational supply chains. And to get at causality, we look at firms that were exposed to robotics inventions over time based upon the occupational composition of the firms and their overlap with the patenting for robotics-related inventions over time. And then we're looking specifically in Spanish firms at when they started adopting robots, how did they change their supply chains? And so a quick preview of results is essentially we found that robot adoption actually did not lead to offshoring, but led to the complete opposite and led to an increase in offshoring to developing countries. And it actually meant that firms were more likely to start importing or opening affiliates in developing countries. And the reason for this was largely due to the productivity effect of automation, because automation in the firms in Spain drove a big productivity and output impact, which then led firms to start also expanding abroad and made them more likely to also do offshoring of other parts of the supply chain that weren't automatable. So this is showing, in fact, contrary to the evidence which I showed at the beginning, automation was not a driver of the reshoring trend, but actually led to greater offshoring. So the data we're using here, and I'll go very quickly through this paper in the interest of time, it's data from ESEE, which is essentially Spanish firm level data. And the key advantage of this data set is it has very good automation variables. In contrast to many firm level surveys, this survey actually asked firms about their use of robots, computer numerically controlled machines, flexible manufacturing systems, and industrial machinery. It also nicely has multinational firm variables, including imports and import intensity from lower income countries. We also then use a couple of other data sets, which are employment data for Spain from the Census of Population and Housing and the Google Patents data set for the patenting part. And we've got a model where firms essentially perform each task, and for each task, they can use labor at home or offshore labor, or they can use robots, but only a certain subset of tasks can be automated or offshored. And to offshore or automate any specific task involves us paying a significant fixed cost, which means there's essentially a productivity cutoff, and only the most productive firms will either automate or offshore tasks, because it requires paying this significant upfront fixed cost. And so advances in automation lead to both a productivity effect, allowing firms to become more productive and therefore expanding their labor demand at home and abroad, and a displacement effect of those specific tasks being displaced. And so what we're doing here specifically is looking at firms in Spain and their adoption of robots, which is this robot variable, and how this affects their outcomes in terms of their offshoring to developing countries and demand for labor at home. And as the adoption of robots is unlikely to be exogenous, we're essentially using an instrument for robot adoption, which is based upon the patenting variable. So here the idea is, over time, a lot of robotics inventions became commercially viable, but whether or not they became commercially viable for a firm's task is largely exogenous to that firm, because the firm was probably doing the activities they were doing a long time ago, and then one day they discover there are actually commercially viable robots to replace some of their tasks. So a firm was exposed to automation based upon the task structure of what its workers were doing before these inventions took place. And so what we find is robot users are already significantly larger, more productive, and they're more likely to have multinational affiliates, and they're more likely to import and export. Then firms were more likely to have already started using robots before they started offshoring. And it's really the most productive firms that are able to both automate their production and offshore to lower income countries. Then coming to the causal results, what we found here is that the use of robots essentially made firms more likely to import from developing countries and more likely to import more intensively from developing countries. And it meant they were more likely to increase their number of affiliates in developing countries as well, which is this affiliates variable. Then it also, when we look at whether firms are likely to start offshoring, we find they were more likely to start offshoring or importing from developing countries. And when we look at the activities they're doing in these countries, it's more likely to be starting either similar production in these countries or marketing and distribution in these countries. Then another question for firms, one question is for firms that weren't offshoring before, how did robots affect them? But another question for firms that already had production offshore, when they start using robots in Spain, does it lead them to reshore production back to Spain? And what we found here is it doesn't. And firms, essentially, we find no results for firms that had already offshored to develop. There was no change in their offshoring. And one of the key drivers of these results appears to be that firms that start using robots see a significant boost to their employment, their production, and their productivity. Their labor productivity and their total factor productivity both go up after they start using robots. And we show these results are robust to a range of different weightings, excluding the financial crisis, using different identification strategies, not only looking at the auto industry, and various other robustness checks. So to conclude from this paper, what we found is, contrary to expectations, firms that start using robots in Spain actually had a strong positive impact on their likelihood of offshoring and the value of their offshoring to developing countries. Seems to be driven by a productivity effect, where firms that start using robots increase their productivity, they expand, and they're more likely to start opening locations abroad and offshoring to developing countries. And we find the same doesn't hold for offshoring to high-income countries, suggesting they're still using offshoring as a way to lower their overall production costs. And the fact that robots allow them to expand and increase productivity makes that more likely. So I'll pause there now for questions on that paper as well.
We're welcoming any questions. Okay, in terms of time, if we don't have any question at this moment for the second paper, Katherine, let's just go to the third, and we can, include questions on this one later.
Yes, I'll do that then. Okay, so now this is a paper which we're fast forwarding a little bit to 2022 and low carbon technologies and their diffusion in the midst of the energy crisis. So far we looked at multinational firm linkages as enabler of diffusion of technologies. We also looked at the role of multinational networks and the impact of offshoring on these, the impact of robots and advances in robotics on these networks. And now we're looking at multinational networks and country interlinkages in the energy sector and how that has affected the adoption of technologies related to the clean energy transition. And so we know, so the starting point for this paper is we know that to meet net zero goals, firms will have to substantially increase the diffusion of clean energy technologies. But we don't know that much about what's driving the diffusion of these technologies, partially because there's been limited data. So a lot of literature has looked specifically at patenting for low carbon technologies. But of course, patenting doesn't necessarily reflect adoption at the firm or household level. Likewise, a lot of literature has studied one specific low carbon technology in a specific industry or country, but we know relatively little about the spread of these technologies over time globally. And so what we're doing here is very similar to the first paper. We're also using job adverts to identify technologies that are low carbon technologies. And we're then studying the diffusion of these technologies in 35 countries over the past 3 years and 16 countries over the past 8 years. And then we're going to look specifically at what happened with the big shock that happened with the global energy crisis in 2022 in terms of accelerating this diffusion. And so what we find specifically is these clean energy technologies showed relatively limited diffusion over the past 8 years, but we saw very rapid diffusion in 2022. And this was particularly fast in jobs related to the clean energy transition, where we saw very rapid technology diffusion in 2022. And it appears a key role of this was the price shock from the energy crisis, which led to a significant increase in energy prices, and particularly natural gas prices, and that countries that were more reliant on their imports of fossil fuels from affected countries were more likely to suddenly scale up or see faster diffusion of clean energy technologies. So this also suggests that trade in energy plays a crucial role in energy prices, and these shocks can dissipate through countries and spur technology adoption. So I'll come straight to this data. So we're using a similar data of online job adverts, which allows us to measure the technologies. Again, the advantage of using this job adverts data is it allows us to get very specific words being mentioned in the job ads. For example, energy efficient lighting or solar panels, heat pumps, electric vehicles, which we wouldn't yet have nice industry classifications for. So we can really get at using this data in a way that's kind of daily updated and in real time. And similarly, we match this to firm level data from FactSet, which is multinational firms data. And we also take firm level admissions data from CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project. And so what we're doing here is we're essentially going to extract all the keywords related to the technologies measured by the European Patent Office. They've constructed a nice database of patents related to climate mitigation technologies, which they've updated regularly based upon new technologies that are emerging. So what we're doing is extracting essentially all of the nouns related to the technologies in this classification, and then we're searching for them in English and the translation in the country's national languages in these job adverts, which allows us to pin down these 46 low carbon technologies related to them. So here's a couple of examples of job adverts mentioning low carbon technologies. One, for example, a dams engineer related to large hydropower projects in Canada. Another is a contracts manager for pipelines of wind farms in Australia and wind farm delivery. So the second, if we see a growth in these type of job adverts, that is suggestive of a significant increase in the diffusion of wind technology in the country or firm or region. And so we're using it as a proxy. And so our headline result is, and this is the share of online job adverts across these 16 countries over time related to low carbon technologies. And as we see here, growth was fairly flat from 2014 up until around 2021. But what we really saw was this really big increase in diffusion of low carbon technologies in 2022, which is now kind of growing exponentially. And likewise, when we look at earnings calls, we saw quite a big increase in firms mentioning these technologies in 2022. And when we look at the country level, this was particularly fast in Europe. So France, Germany, Luxembourg saw the fastest growth in low carbon technology hiring. And nearly everywhere saw at least a 25% increase relative to 2021 in 2022. Which is, and these shares are kind of similar to what's been found in other measures in the literature. And this is by country. So you see there's quite a few in Europe, which saw this big increase. So Germany here and France here. But across the board, almost all countries saw quite a rapid increase. And when we look at the locations, this is a little bit hard to see, but essentially Europe saw quite substantially faster growth in 2022. And when we look at the technologies this was driven by, it was really renewable energy, the diffusion of electric vehicles, and improved thermal performance, which is essentially insulation and heat pumps. And these are the technology, particularly if you see at the top, job adverts for renewables, renewable energy particularly grew and kind of at least more than doubled in 2022 relative to 2021. And in terms of the industries, this was really in manufacturing, construction, and electricity, gas, and utility industries. And most of these, when we look at the types of occupations we saw growth in, it wasn't research occupations. It was more likely to be roles like installers, construction-related roles, sales roles, manufacturing roles, suggesting this was an increase in deployment of these technologies rather than an increase in innovation or research related to them. And this growth occurred for most of the occupations types, but was particularly rapid at the top for high-skilled. So then coming to the role of the energy price shock, this graph on the right shows how energy prices increased in 2021 and 2022. So at the bottom, and we see there was significant global variation in this price shock. So at the bottom is the US Henry Hub natural gas price, which essentially barely changed at all across the energy crisis. But at the top, we see both the Asian and the European gas prices, and particularly the price of natural gas in the EU, which is this blue line. It really grew and spiked in kind of mid-2022 at a level that was kind of at least triple, if not more, what it was pre-pandemic or at least 2021. So the price was around 10, and it grew up here to around 70 in the peak. So that's a 7-fold increase. And half of European countries had wholesale electricity prices that were at least 12 times their 2018 value by August 2022. So really the largest spike in energy prices we've seen since the oil price shocks in the 1970s, and a really significant increase in energy prices in Europe. And so we saw lots of anecdotal evidence. I mean, there was a lot of discussion at the time about countries shifting back to coal in order to decrease their reliance on natural gas. But there was also a lot of anecdotal evidence that there was an increase in countries trying to scale up renewables or trying to increase offshore wind capacity or heat pumps in order to lower their reliance on Russian natural gas. But we know relatively little about the quantitative size and whether this was a causal impact. So what we do here, we're essentially looking at the variation in countries' exposure to the energy price shock based upon their dependence on imports of natural gas or fossil fuels, which we take from this data from the IEA, which is their essentially import dependence on natural gas or fossil fuels. And then we also look at firms that were more exposed because they were more energy intensive. So for this, we take firm level data on essentially fuel consumption per unit of sales to look at the energy firms. And so then what we're doing is asking our countries that were more exposed to this shock in energy prices, did they see a faster increase in low carbon technology hiring? And did firms that were more energy intensive see relatively greater increase in this diffusion of low carbon technologies? And we're looking both at a before-after specification and an event study specification. And so what we find is essentially establishments that were in countries that had a higher import dependence on natural gas before the price shock happened. saw a substantial increase in the postings related to low carbon technologies after February 2022, which was when the energy crisis really started due to the invasion of Ukraine. And what we see is when we look both at country level exposure and firms that were more energy intensive within these countries, firms that were more energy intensive also saw a relative increase relative to less energy intensive firms in these more exposed countries. And when we look at the categories this is driven by, it really appears to be mainly driven by generation, in that firms and countries are switching to increase the renewables in their generation mix as a result of this crisis. And this is the timing of the effects we see. So the effects really started increasing around early 2022. And then we see, but weren't statistically significant before the crisis, and then really peaked towards the end of 2022 when we see substantial increase in hiring related to low carbon technologies. And when we look at other types of jobs, we don't see any increase. So this energy crisis has really triggered an increase in the diffusion of low carbon technologies, but hasn't changed other hiring patterns, it would seem. And then we look, a key question is then, was it that countries that were more exposed to the energy price shock just had different characteristics in the first place? But we find when we look at countries that were more dependent on natural gas as imports or fossil fuels as imports, they don't seem to have any different characteristics. So it appears that countries that were more exposed should have been similar or should have seen similar patterns in low carbon technology hiring anyway. Likewise, firms that were more energy intensive, there's some slight difference in that they have some slightly lower margin ratios, but otherwise, whether firms were more exposed to the energy price shock also seems to be uncorrelated with other characteristics. And when we also look at other fossil fuels, given the price shock initially was for natural gas, but it quickly spread to all fossil fuels, we find some evidence of similar impacts, that firms in countries that were more exposed to fossil fuel price increases in general saw an increase in the postings, and more energy intensive firms do as well. But we don't find that more energy intensive firms in more fossil fuel exposed countries saw this increase. So it appears to be mainly through exposure to natural gas, which saw the fastest price shock. And when we drop fossil fuel producers that also saw changed effects, we find similar results. Another thing that happened during this time is a lot of countries started offering fossil fuel subsidies to try and counterbalance the impacts of the energy crisis. But once we control for these, our results actually strengthen, suggesting that governments actually acted to try to limit this energy price shock. But once you control for that, we still see this increase in low carbon technology hiring. Likewise, another potential mechanism was that countries that were more exposed may have started increasing their use of green industrial policies. For example, the US, the Inflation Reduction Act happened in the end of 2022, which could be linked to the energy price shock. However, once we control for any changes in green industrial policies over this time, we still see this strong positive impact of the energy crisis. So to sum up, we saw rapid diffusion of low carbon technologies in 2022, with growth in a range of countries and industries. And this appears to be driven by jobs related to renewable energy and electric vehicles particularly. And we find this was not limited to any research roles, suggesting this really was accelerated adoption of these technologies. And what we find is there was this very important role of the energy crisis, which led to a very rapid increase in natural gas prices, with countries around the world differentially exposed depending on their import dependence of natural gas. And countries that were more exposed, their firms saw an increase in the adoption of low carbon technologies after 2022. and more energy intensive firms saw a relative increase relative to less energy intensive firms, suggesting firms were shifting to low carbon technologies to lower their energy dependence on fossil fuels and particularly natural gas, which suggests that energy price shocks and energy prices more broadly still play an important role in triggering the diffusion of low carbon technologies. And that while this crisis had many negative impacts, it may have also spurred kind of a restructuring and a different approach of firms in terms of scaling up new technologies. So I will finish there. That's the end of then the final paper. So I'm now happy to take questions on any of these papers.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, I think we just open the floor for questions either on this last paper or any of the first two papers as well. Maybe I'll start with the last one. And this is something that I'm quite interested in because I'm working on ESG, carbon commitments of companies, and we're looking at a short period of time, and essentially the data is about talents, right? And it's about moving of talents, and assuming that the total number of talents didn't change. So is there, because I saw one of the early kind of effects was that I saw two countries, Canada and Switzerland, right? They have a different trend. I wonder two things. One, whether this movement of talents and induce, of course, technology transfer diffusion, are restricted by the total number of talents, in some way. Is that does that cause the pattern where you saw? But I kind of see probably not. It may have also to do with some other policies in some of these specific countries. I could see Canada and Switzerland are different, but Switzerland is in Europe, but not EU. And the other one, of course, is you have controlled in some way, but I wonder whether countries, are in different kind of stages of their energy transition. That affects how, what kind of jobs, and technologies their companies they have a different portfolio of companies in this low carbon technology space, right? So are there any kind of variations there where probably not controlled in your current study that might explain some of the patterns?
Yeah, so I think on the first question, and thank you again, really good questions. On the first one about talent, so we're, given this is looking at job adverts, we're really only getting at the demand side of what firms are demanding. But of course, firms may be putting out, they may have a high demand, say for machine learning engineers or for heat pump installers that they then actually can't find the supply for. And I know particularly in the latter with clean energy, a lot of countries have a significant shortage of people with the right skill set to meet these green jobs. Particularly, I think in construction industries, there's been a shortage in Europe, and that's also really slowed down the diffusion. So it might be that we're just not picking up that important impact, which is then what's happening on the supply side. Because supply often can't keep up with demand. I think Canada and Switzerland, it could also be that they're able to, maybe the supply of talent enables them to be able to see this big increase in demand. I know at least Canada has very quite liberal immigration policies. I don't know about Switzerland, honestly, but I guess a lot of people are able to relocate to Switzerland within the EU. So it may be that having fairly liberal talent attraction programs also enables them to see this faster diffusion. That's not something we've looked at, but we could look at by looking at the gap between the demand and supply for these technologies and whether countries also see faster diffusion because they're more able to attract the top talents.
Sure. Okay, let's see whether we have any other questions on any of the papers.
Hi, Catherine. I'm wondering if you can draw some more predictions based on your three papers, the studies you have done. Can you give us some more, just forecast regarding the future of tech diffusion, and you see with this AI revolution, is there anything, will there be anything different?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. So I think, the paper on Spain and robots suggests that a lot of the predictions about these technologies ending multinational supply chains and offshoring don't seem to be correct. And you see some of those with AI as well, suggesting AI is going to mean we no longer see offshoring to India, and these developing countries see negative impacts of this. I think that paper suggests is probably not likely to be true. If anything, these technologies have all these positive dynamic impacts on increasing skill demand and productivity, which tend to just expand globalization. So I would think, if anything, these technologies will expand globalization and not contract it. Although, of course, geopolitical tensions at the same time are leading in the opposite direction. But it's hard to curb if there's big increases in productivity because of AI, and that's leading to huge demand. I think a lot of countries will end up soaking that up. The third paper on the energy transition, if this type of trend continues to increase, which it looks, most of the data suggests now deployment of EVs and solar is really growing exponentially globally and is only just in the early stages. So if that continues, obviously that means a big increase in hiring related to those technologies, and potentially increases in productivity through the expansion of all these new industries around the world, which then I think could have very positive impacts for countries that can tap into gaining from that wave. And obviously it could take a while before that hits a lot of emerging markets outside of China, because obviously this is already happening really rapidly in China. But I think that could become a huge driver of growth, and then could also change patterns of globalization through these new products being purchased from other countries. That's one. Obviously, there's many interactions between clean energy technologies and AI these days, and that clean energy technologies are decreasing demand for emissions, but AI is massively increasing emissions. So quite how those two balance out will be another question. But did you want, when you asked for projections, on which specific topics, on globalization or on technologies, or any more specific areas you're interested in?
Let's talk about some catch-up of developing countries. As you are from World Bank, I think you maybe have you already have a lot of thinking on this issue.
Yeah, so I think in terms of catch-up, the first paper in the multinational firm networks paper suggests that I think there's still great potential for countries to catch up, particularly through tapping into these multinational supply chains. And I think with diffusion accelerating and the faster pace and easier nature of globalization, that could mean we could see faster spread of new technologies to developing countries. So I think we have the positive technological trend and the positive globalization trend of the past few decades. But on the contrary, we've got the real negative trend of geoeconomic fragmentation and political tensions, leading to kind of the fragmentation of supply chains, which at the same time is causing multinationals to rethink their strategies and maybe be more cautious, which could, on the other hand, limit the spread of these technologies, right? If we end up having two very separate multinational supply chains, one around China and Asia and one cut off in other parts of the world, then that could really slow the spread of these technologies. So I think there's these two factors moving in opposite directions on that. But I think for clean energy technologies and what that means for development, I think it's probably a positive there. I'd say there's a positive trend for catch up, just because this is a new wave of technologies with new potential to have new opportunities for manufacturing and production, which the whole world is demanding because of this need to switch away from fossil fuels, which could be a positive avenue for kind of manufacturing-led development when we're seeing a contraction in demand for other industries. So I think overall, I'd say I'm positive, except for this wider trend of geopolitical fragmentation, which could change things. But otherwise, the faster spread of technologies, this expansion of multinational networks, and big demand for new green technologies could all be good things, I think, for catch-up of developing countries.
Thank you. That's insightful.
Okay, I hope that answered to some degree, but it's very difficult to speculate on such big topics.
Hi, Katherine. I have a couple of questions on the first paper and also hearing the discussions. The first question is that I remember that in the first paper, the findings is that for the different channels, you have the bias that's been found to be quite significant, right? For the suppliers, there's no actual evidence to diffuse as a channel to diffuse technology. So in this context, or given the finding, when you say that for firms to join global value chains, especially for firms coming from developing countries, we know that often they are suppliers, they are the production centers, right? So given this result, I mean, then to what extent can firms actually from developing countries actually benefit from technology diffusion? And relatedly, I'm also curious that in the first paper, did you, given the large sample of firms you have, did you try to, let's say, categorize firms into different, income level, coming from different income level countries? Because perhaps, for firms from high income countries, the channel might be different. For firms coming from low income countries, I'm just speculating, it might be different. And another question that I have is, and also it's a paper by Nick Bloom, I think it was published in 2013 in Econometrica, where they also look at technology diffusion or technology spillovers. And there, I think the main story is about the technology proximity, how close the firms are in technology space. And that is a big driver of technology spillover. So I'm also curious that if you take this into account, would that change the result, or might this technology proximity also play a moderating role somehow in your result? Because I mean, you have the firms, you have the patent data, and then you could easily map the firms in the technology space and then see what the results are. Thank you.
Thank you. These are really good questions. Particularly, I like the latter. So on the first question of buyers versus suppliers, so we were also slightly surprised by this result, because when you look at the literature, as you said, a lot of the literature on firm spillovers of supplying to a more productive firm has been through suppliers, as you mentioned. So lots of evidence that if you're selling to a multinational because they have higher product standards, and they often provide training for their suppliers, you're more likely to increase your productivity.
Yeah, exactly.
But it could, yeah, exactly. So we were surprised to see that. But then when you think about it as well, that could mean that you're more likely to upgrade your productivity or your quality standards, but less likely to start understanding how to use a new technology. Whereas it could be, say, if you're buying a product from a key firm that's selling that product, maybe then that's where the spread of ideas happens, because you're able to backward induce what they're doing. So say if you're buying certain software or like patented inventions from a company that sells them, maybe you're more likely to then start getting ideas from that, or you could backward induce what the
Right.
company's done through that. So
So
that's why we,
yes, this is more like embodied technology, right?
exactly, yeah. So we think it's maybe more embodied technological change as opposed to firm productivity upgrading, because obviously we're not looking at productivity. We're just looking at whether you start hiring related to those technologies. So
Right.
maybe it's more the ideas. Whereas if you're just selling your product to a company, maybe you increase your standards, but you're not aware of the kind of technological frontier, and so then it's less likely to spread innovation. Anyway, that's our only hypothesis on that, but that's exactly what we're trying to understand more. But I think embodied technological change is our key hypothesis. Then on your question of have we broken down results by income groups. So the challenge is with that first paper, we've only got these 16 advanced economies, or 17, and they're all, every single one is high income, except I think Bulgaria maybe switched to become high income during the sample, but is still like an upper middle income country. So it's really, those results are really high income driven. Just because unfortunately the data on emerging economies, that tends to be far less good coverage of the job adverts data. And so we're not able to use it well because you end up having a really unrepresentative sample. So we did try using a wider number of countries, but then the coverage is just too poor saying anything. But I think what we could do is break that down into like deciles within the income categories, just to see whether there's any difference between a lower income, high income country and a very high income country. And I'll definitely think about that. Then on the product space, the technology product space question, I think this is a really good question. And so this is the thing we're doing at the moment for that paper is try to understand these firms that are buyers or innovation partners, why they are buyers or innovation partners in the first place. So to do that, we've been looking at industry and whether you see proximity in terms of industries and are they more technologically advanced industries. But I hadn't thought of looking at the technological space. So I'll take a look at that 2013 Econometrica paper you mentioned and see if we could do that and see whether it's that they become buyers or they were buyers in the first place because they're doing more similar technologies. Because that would be important if you're actually seeing just the diffusion, because they were more likely to do it in the first place relative to they end up doing it because they're buying from this company. So thank you. That's really helpful. I'll definitely look into that.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions. I actually do still have one related to the first paper, but actually at least the first and third together, especially when we were looking at the pools of technologies, right? We saw mainly digital tech, and I would say low carbon tech or renewable energy in your first paper in a data set, right? Even just within these high income countries. And one thing that I'm curious, I mean, very keen, to think about is actually often we say we need a dual transformation. We need a green transformation and a digital transformation together. And especially when you talk about AI and the short-term energy implications, we need a diffusion of good digital tech and low carbon tech. And is it possible to can you imagine to look at how they go in hand in hand in a way, whether you could see some kind of dual transformation driven by this the in parallel transmission of these technologies. And I mean, understanding it's not going to be easy to classify these kind of these things. So a related question would be your methodology analyzing these job postings the earnings calls. We're working with other colleagues on using earnings calls to look at their company's climate compliance, for example. But we're also thinking the last couple of years with large language model being more and more used in research in everywhere, including economics. Have you ever thought of applying some of these new AI tools in analyzing these data and helping answering, for example, this dual transmission of technologies to big groups of technologies kind of questions?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. The answer is I would love to. We've started trying to use large language models actually to do something a bit different, which is for the low carbon technologies paper, look at what firms are using those technologies for to try and understand a little bit more why are they using them. But I hadn't thought of the question of the intersection between digital tech and low carbon tech, I think is a really interesting one. And I would love to look at that and see whether firms that are more like adopting more digital tech are more likely to be adopting low carbon tech. And obviously, I think that there's the positive impacts that digital firms using more digital tech may be more efficient and more able to use the low carbon tech in a better way. And there's lots of ways in which digital tech could be speeding up the diffusion of AI tech and green tech, and improving it like through better grid transmission or optimization of grids and energy consumption. But there's also the other aspect of whether you see firms going the other way of using a lot more energy because they're using AI. So I would love to look at that, but I haven't yet had the time to start those projects, but I think that would be really interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely consider it. Thanks for the research ideas.
The next couple of years, maybe it's going to be very chaotic if you really look at it right now, but somehow getting prepared, I think that will be very interesting, and especially in understanding how policies could help speeding up this necessary synergy, right? For hopefully for both the developed economies and also the emerging and developing economies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Maybe just one last question.
Please.
Yeah. About the second paper on automation and trade. I'm just curious that if you have any occupation data, or if you know which part of the production process or tasks that's being automated. Because as you mentioned in the paper, that the most productive firms that are able to both automate and expand trade with low-income countries. So I'm just curious that whether these technologies, they are actually doing the same task as the people or what they produce in low-income countries, or it's a more complementary augmenting technologies that's being adopted in advanced in Spain in this case.
Yeah, so this is a crucial question. Unfortunately, that data did not have good it had just very broad occupational groups, but it didn't have anything detailed. So we could, and particularly for the offshore locations, there was nothing on the occupations they were hiring. I think the only variable was that one I showed, which asked them, what is the activity of this multinational? And I think there we found there were two results. One is they said the answer was the box of similar production to in Spain. So that suggests substitutability, but of course it could be similar production, but of a very different component or something, right? Types of tasks. So that we couldn't really get at. The other one was there was positive results for marketing and distribution, which suggest maybe not just because of the gains, but also because they plan to sell in that country. So they're expanding to the new market through producing there and expanding, which suggests it's more complementary. But yeah, unfortunately, that data was really aggregated, so we couldn't really get at it. But that's a really crucial question that I would love to look at if there was data that was more detailed.
Right, and I think if you if you can have this more granular data, then you can really speak to the other mainstream views saying that automation really leads to reshoring. Because now, because you might have different technologies there. Because then in this case, basically your result is not really on the same page as what they're, claiming in a way.
Yeah, it's just very hard to know whether it is from this, as we just only see these very aggregate variables. I mean, I think if it's similar production, if it was producing the exact same thing and the exact same tasks, then that would suggest it's definitely not reshoring, because they're just moving out and doing the same thing. But if it's that they're just actually doing something complementary or upgrading or then selling their products to new markets as well, then obviously then it's less clear that they decided not to reshore. But thank you again. I think that would be a great paper if someone had slightly better data.
Okay. I think we'll just call it for tonight's webinar. And thank you again, Katherine, for the really interesting papers. And especially when you put them together, it really, I mean, at least for me to think about some bigger questions that, for the challenges we're facing, in different economies.